bare ønsker velkommen.
Hæ?
Du bare ønsker velkommen.
Ja, skal jeg bare starte, så tar du... Ja. Vi... Skal vi videre, eller på minutter? Ja, du har programmet der.
Ja, det står 12:45 her.
Ja. Ok, da begynner vi.
Og så må...
Ja, da har jeg æren av å ønske velkommen til dette møtet med Francis Haugen, som jeg er veldig glad for at har kommet hit. Grunnen til at vi inviterer til dette møtet, det er at sosiale mediekanaler, sånn som Facebook og Twitter, de har jo uten tvil gjort veien til offentligheten mye kortere for veldig mange i samfunnet vårt. Mange som tidligere ikke har hatt mulighet til det, som ikke har hatt tilgang til debattprogrammer eller til å få oppslag i media. Og det har blant annet gitt mange menneskerettighetsforkjempere en digital plattform som gjør at de kan komme med sitt budskap, og som gjør at de kan organisere seg. Så sosiale medier har uten tvil mange positive sider. Men disse plattformene har også en mørkere side, som det er veldig viktig at vi snakker om, og at vi diskuterer hva vi kan gjøre politisk for å redusere, rett og slett. Mange er jo vel kjent med hvordan for eksempel hetsere bruker sosiale medier. Det blir enklere å da trakassere folk, både enkeltpersoner, men også grupper. Og de som lever kanskje mer kontroversielle liv, som er litt annerledes enn flertallet, opplever jo ofte at de blir utsatt for den type hets. Da Francis Haugen publiserte dokumenter som hun har tatt med seg da hun sluttet i Facebook, så viste hun at Facebook har store utfordringer som de ikke har gjort nok for å håndtere. Og de bruker da algoritmer som bidrar til at hets og ekstreme holdninger og desinformasjon prioriteres. Rett og slett fordi at det er det som gir mest inntjening. Og at sosiale medier, sånn som Instagram og Snapchat, som jo for veldig mange ungdommer har vært viktig for å kunne uttrykke seg, kanskje vise identiteten sin, kommunisere med andre, også bidrar til at det blir vondere å bli utestengt. Det bidrar til at det blir lettere å mobbe, og for mange så har det blant annet bidratt til å forsterke dårlig kroppslig selvbilde og spiseforstyrrelser. Og så er det også åpenbart noen enorme personvernutfordringer som ligger bak når vi bruker apper, sosiale medier eller googler noen ting, og alt det vi gjør spores. Hver dag så dannes det flere 100 digitale profiler om oss, og vi lever under konstant digital overvåking. Veldig mye av det her har vi takket ja til frivillig, men spørsmålet er jo hvor mye vet egentlig folk selv om hva det er man takker ja til når man gjør det. Det vi vet er jo at det brukes for å målrette reklame for oss, men det kan også brukes for å treffe oss for eksempel når vi er mest sårbare. For eksempel at en person som er spillavhengig, som prøver å slutte å gamble, får opp annonser som da frister denne personen til å fortsette med det. Og informasjon kan også brukes diskriminerende. Så det er ingen tvil om at disse sosiale medieplattformene reiser veldig mange dilemmaer, mange utfordringer som vi er nødt til å ta tak i politisk. Heldigvis så skjer det en bevegelse i flere land, både i USA og i EU, men vi har helt åpenbart ikke kommet langt nok. I Venstre så har vi satt i gang en del arbeid på det her. Vi har levert forslag på Stortinget også, men vi ønsker altså da med det møtet her å bidra til å opplyse debatten enda mer. Så det var det jeg skulle si innledningsvis. Jeg tok det på norsk siden de fleste i salen er norsk, men da skal jeg gi ordet videre til Sofie Høgestøl, som er den som leder det her seansen.
Tusen takk. Da skal jeg først invitere opp Dag Trøvold fra Noram, som skal overlevere en pris. We're going to do the award ceremony part first, so we remember to do it before we start our conversation.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much for the opportunity for us to come here and present this award. It's a privilege for me as a member of the board of the Norway America Association, NORAM. NORAM is a non-profit membership association And since 1907, our mission has been to strengthen the bonds between Norway and North America through academic and cultural exchange. We do this by awarding scholarships to Norwegian students with a desire to study in North America and at North American universities and colleges, and for North American students to come to Norway. Through the years, more than 6,000 recipients have benefited from our program. And also for the younger children, up to 18, we have an annual event, Norgesskolen, that offers 2.5-week language training at Varv in Telemark. I hope you know where Varv is, Francis. And the association is open to everyone. It's a membership association, and the patron is His Majesty King Harald. The American-Norway Heritage Fund, an award. The purpose is to honor Americans of Norwegian descent, which we understand that you are, who have made significant contributions to American culture and society. And we hope that this prize also can enable more visits by the recipients of the award. And it's the last time the award actually was given was in 2008. So it's quite a rare occasion. The understanding for the importance of transatlantic cooperation has during the past years become less visible, I would say, on both sides of the ocean. The war in Europe has, however, clearly demonstrated our close links and the common understanding of the value of freedom and democracy. We believe these principles are worth fighting for, and the mission of NORAM will be even more important in the future as we give young people the opportunity to exchange knowledge and friendship through education. And the values here closely links with awarding the Heritage Award to Francis Haugen. You have made a substantial personal effort to disclose practical and social media practices, and with a strong negative impact on young people. You have, through your work, shown courage and taken a personal risk. And you have also, by speaking up, raised the awareness of the social media. And thanks to your testimony, it's now common understanding that Facebook is placing its own rather than the public's interest first. Open debate and transparency are of vital importance to a democratic society. Strong independent voices like yours and free exchange of information are the lifeblood of a liberal society. Your contribution is strengthening democracy because regardless of the final outcome, we are establishing a better and more critical approach to big tech. Well, the fact that your family descends from Larvik gives your efforts special meaning here in Norway. You're always proud when people of Norwegian descent makes their point. So there are quite a few Haugens in Norway that feel a very close relationship to you. And we're also very happy that you have globalized the Haugen name. You have shared some of the stories that you have been told through the generations in the US, and I understand you may be the 4th generation, maybe. Mm-hmm. And every time a story is told and given over to the next generation, it's a new twist. Yeah. So I hope that by awarding this Heritage Award to you, you will have a new opportunity to experience and get more knowledge about Norway. And NORAM will, of course, welcome you back at all times. So, transatlantic cooperation is built on common values, democracy, respect for human rights, with reference to January 6th and Ukraine. We know that democracy is under threat and cannot be taken for granted. It's therefore of great importance that democracy is cultivated and defended by active citizens, brave citizens like Frances Haugen. Congratulations, it's my pleasure to award you the Norway America Heritage Award. It's a prize of $10,000 and an ostehøvel, which is a cheese slice, which you probably have seen. So congratulations.
Okay, that was lovely.
I do have bad news for the Haugens in Larvik, though. We were Olsons until we moved to Wisconsin. There were literally too many Ole Olsons in the village in Wisconsin, and we became Haugens at that point because we couldn't get the mail. So sorry, Haugens.
I'm sure they're very happy with the change now.
Yeah.
So my name is Sofie Høgestøl, and I'm normally an associate professor of law, but today I'm meeting as a member of parliament. Because sadly we have some sickness in our group. But I'm thrilled to be here today with you. Because as my summer reading this summer, I read An Ugly Truth, which is a book about Facebook by Cecilia Kang and Shara Frankel. And my normal research is I research international criminal or atrocity crimes. And I think there were many facets of that book that disturbed me. But one of them was how Facebook was used in the genocide in Myanmar. That was information that I did not know at that point.
Yeah.
And I thought to myself back to when I myself first got Facebook, which was all the way back in, must have been about 2006. I was studying in London, and my university was one of the first universities to get Facebook internationally. And little did I know at the time, we felt very exclusive because it was this thing at Harvard, and then we got to be part of the group as well, and we felt this is all very exclusive. But at the time, I had no understanding of the product that I was using, or what why anyone would create this platform in the first place, and sort of to especially reread the sort of the beginnings of Facebook and understand the intentions behind the network, that it was always about my data and always about my attention, was quite gripping. And I have to say, the end point of the story is that I didn't quit. I really thought, can I, morally speaking, as someone who studies atrocity crimes, still stay on Facebook? And I'm still on Facebook. I went back and forth for a week. Can I quit? But I think this is, something that a lot of us grapple with. And then when you came with your whistleblower testimony, I was gripped by your testimony to Congress, because a lot of what you spoke about really fed into what I've just read in this book.
Yeah.
And we're going to give you the opportunity to open with a statement. So please, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon. Thank you for inviting me to speak today. My name is Frances Haugen, and as someone of Norwegian heritage, it is a special honor to testify before you. Last year, I left my job at Facebook as I felt I could no longer be part of a system which harms children, stokes polarization, and weakens our democracies. I disclosed what I felt governments and the public should know about what is happening within these social media giants, the deliberate choices they make to maximize their profit at the expense of public safety, the never-ending pursuit of growth at any cost. The care of family, the value of a healthy nation were part of my upbringing. I grew up in a home where the kitchen was full of white crocheted potholders made by my Norwegian great-grandmother, Matilda Haugen, with stories about what could be learned of Amundsen's explorations in the Arctic and Antarctic. One of the few stories I know of my great-grandfather was that one of his most treasured memories was that he was able to return to Norway that he had left as a small boy to play in the band at the coronation of Haugen VII and the establishment of a sovereign Norway. It is a great honor to follow in his footsteps and return to Oslo to provide testimony today about the need to protect Norway from a modern threat to Norwegian sovereignty. The Meta Corporation and their neglect of public safety and their endangerment of speakers of non-English languages. I hope my revelations have been valuable to parliaments like this one. It is clear that governments all over the world have been searching for answers about how to tackle some of the biggest issues of the day, how to protect their citizens and their democracies, but they didn't have enough information to even get to ask the right questions, let alone write the answers. I want to acknowledge that these are difficult, once-in-a-generation challenges that you're trying to solve. This isn't easy, but the struggle is important. That is beginning to change, with European nations leading the way in developing game-changing digital regulations. The Digital Services Act at the EU level will play an important role in holding some of the most powerful companies in the world to account. Self-regulation of social media has not worked. Platforms cannot be trusted to act in the public interest independently. They are often, as my disclosures demonstrate, fully aware of the harms caused by their products and services, yet choose to ignore these in favor of growth and profit. The mandatory transparency measures that give researchers access to data from platforms in the Digital Services Act will be an important step towards accountability and the building of a public muscle of accountability. Up until now, platforms and their profitable algorithms have remained inside a black box intentionally. Any democratic digital regulation needs to respect rights while getting to the heart of the business model of the platforms, addressing the algorithms and the design features that enable the spread of disinformation and hate. As I wrote in the Financial Times this week, international civil society groups have spent years warning social media platforms and lawmakers of crises, often in real time. They have nowhere near the resources of big tech, yet much of the public's analysis of social media's harms is because of the massive evidence base they have created. Without this, emerging regulation would be built on theories of harm as opposed to actual facts. Another early leader in sounding the alarm bells about how big tech harms rights and democracy visited Oslo in December to accept her Nobel Peace Prize. Her name is Maria Ressa. Her work represents the spirit of resistance for those who claim their agency over the algorithm and the refusal to let a faceless corporation destabilize their democracy. While journalists and civil society groups play a critical role in highlighting the harms of big tech, and parliaments have an important opportunity for democratic oversight, there is one other lever of power that Norway has at its disposal: the Government Pension Fund of Norway. The pension fund owns 1.01% of Meta. This gives the Norwegian state and citizens a unique opportunity to use this investment for good. The stated objective of the fund is to ensure the responsible and long-term management of revenue from Norway's oil and gas resources. But as the disclosures I have made demonstrated, Meta is not a responsible actor that can be trusted with our children, our personal data, or our democracies. Climate disinformation that proliferates on Facebook makes it harder for the world to agree on common solutions to combat climate change. During the pandemic, we saw the negative consequences of COVID conspiracies and vaccine hesitancy. I'm meeting with teachers' unions later next month, and they literally talk about death threats against teachers because of these things. We have never in America seen death threats against teachers at the scale that we're seeing right now. During eating disorders, anxiety, and bullying are all rampant in the news feeds of our children. If Meta were a normal company, the pension fund would hold 1.01% of voting rights at Meta's shareholder meetings. But because of the obscure nature of the share structure, this is not the case. This gives the fund very limited options for shareholder activism or exerting influence commonly associated with such a stake in a company. Consequently, I'm urging the Government Pension Fund of Norway to divest its stock from Meta. I make this call not just for moral reasons, but also from a financial risk perspective. The current structure of Meta is one that is so obsessed with flat hierarchies and collective responsibility, not individual responsibility, that the end result is no accountability. This does not bode well for investors. The company has consistently demonstrated that it puts its profits before people while continuing to act with impunity. In the disclosures, it is patently clear that Facebook gives the most reach to the most divisive and polarizing content. And its advertising model allows cheaper ad rates for extreme parties. Substantially cheaper. We're talking 5 to 10 times cheaper. We can't have healthy democracies when it is 5 to 10 times cheaper to run a hateful or divisive ad than it is to run an ad that is an empathetic or consensus building. This represents a systemic risk for all of the fund's investments, right? This isn't just about Facebook. It is about Facebook's impact on everything else. If the fund is to be truly sustainable, it needs to ensure that its investments protect the environment the well-being of Norwegian children, and the safeguarding of democracy. I urge you to use your unique position of influence and moral authority in the world to do the right thing. I'm really looking forward to answering some of your questions, and I look forward to being a constructive friend of Norway in the future.
Thank you so much. I like that you've already given us such a concrete policy initiative that we can follow up on. I thought before we get into the nitty-gritty of the policy, I find your background really, really interesting. And I thought the privilege of being the moderator is asking the first question. I thought, could you tell us your path into Facebook? Because I read somewhere that you said that you joined Facebook to make it less toxic. Like, what brought you to Facebook, and what's your educational background? Because that's also really interesting.
So I had a very unique education in that I went to a very small engineering college called Haugen College. And Haugen is a laboratory school for the development of new engineering curriculum. So it was based on the premise that engineers of the future needed to not be trained to just go into the military industrial complex, which is how engineering curriculum were structured all the way up to, or even today in a lot of schools. Though in order to be effective engineers and have an impact on society, you need to learn about social sciences, you need to learn about entrepreneurship, you need to learn about design. So going into my career, I already had a broader base of education than most people with engineering degrees. I got my degree was also not accredited when I graduated because I was part of the first graduating class. And so I got one job offer, which happened to be at Google. So thank you, Google, for being open-minded. I spent 7.5 years at Google, and I learned about search quality. And I got to be part of kind of the first wave of product managers that thought about algorithms as experiences. And there are very, very few people in the industry who have are people who connect with humans, like really on a broad level, and love the math of algorithms. And I got to be some of the first people in that fraternity. I ended up being founding the machine learning team at Yelp. So if you ever filter for like your menu photo, we built that. It was the first feature. And then I went on to run ranking for the home feed at Pinterest. So during 2016, while the election was building, while the first like big social media misinformation crisis was brewing, I was recovering from being deeply ill. So I have celiacs, I was an indestructible 20-something, and I didn't take it seriously enough. And I ended up weak enough that I got hospitalized, and I had to relearn to walk. And I hired an assistant who was a friend of my little brother's, and he was pivotal in my recovery. Like, he took me walking 5 times a week. He would go swimming with me. He taught me about protein and macros, and like, how do you put more muscle on, kind of thing. And in 2016, after Bernie Sanders lost, he got eaten by the internet, right? Over the course of 6 months, I watched him pull away from me and from our consensus reality. And it didn't matter what I said to him, what information I brought to him. Like the last argument we had, like we'd been exchanging these like 1,000-word emails on, does George Soros run the world economy, right? It's an anti-Semitic meme, right? And he said, do you even read your own citations? These are all from the mainstream media. Like The Guardian. Oh yeah, The Guardian. Oh, so bad. And it was that moment when I realized I had lost him, right? This person who I felt had given me my life back.
So you watched him being radicalized.
I did.
Yeah.
And in the same time, so I'm working on algorithms at Pinterest. I'm like constructing the newsfeed, or our equivalent of our newsfeed. And I'm watching this happen in my life. And then I'm watching Facebook. And I'm watching the product choices that Facebook is making, and it's driving me crazy, right? Like I remember right afterwards, my friend who actually was the equivalent person at Facebook, like he was in charge of ranking for the newsfeed, he wrote this really emotional post about how we have never seen this coming, like, because there was a lot of criticism after Trump's election about the role of misinformation. And I remember I'm a very conciliatory person. Like, I'm a Quaker, like I really believe in pacifism and like reconciliation. And I unloaded on him in the comments. I was like, this feature, like, how could you not see this? Like, I've been watching this for 3 months. And you know, when it came an opportunity to work on civic misinformation, like this recruiter contacted me and I almost flippantly told her the only thing I would work on is misinformation. And she was like, oh, by the way, we have a job for you. And so that's how I ended up at Facebook. Am I not amplified? Uh-oh.
But because I think, to me, this is I'm not a tech person. I'm a social scientist and a legal educator.
But we both study the human condition.
Yes, if
Just
you can
through
call
different
law
means.
the human condition, then yes, we do. But what I found so interesting about the book that I read this summer was that it was so good at illustrating sort of the critical points of departure for Facebook, and that is the introduction of the newsfeed.
Yeah.
Which, you know, me as a consumer, I didn't think much of newsfeed. I didn't understand really what it was. I was like, sure, they're introducing this thing, and I didn't understand how critical that was to both how they make money, but also, how they amplify certain kinds of speech.
Yes.
So, your way into Facebook is starting to criticize some of these algorithms, as you said. Could you explain a little bit how their newsfeed functions for the legislators who maybe are also curious about how this works when we're going to regulate it, or when we're going to try and regulate the space?
So it's really important to remember that when you ask people, you say, "What is Facebook? Tell me what is Facebook?" Almost everyone says Facebook is a place where I connect with my family and friends. Right? That's what people say universally. But the reality is there's two pools of content on Facebook. There's the content you asked for. So that is your family, your friends, the pages you intentionally followed, the groups you intentionally joined. And there's a second pool, which is content you did not ask for. So that's things like your friend commented on a post, they'll put it in your feed, right? Because it might be of interest to you, your friend commented on it. If someone invites you to a group, they believe you being in groups so much because they know you'll consume more content that they will treat it as a follow for 30 days. And if you engage with any of that content, now you're stuck in that group. And they have sued people who have made tools that make it easy for you to mass unsubscribe to groups. Right? There used to be an unfollow plugin, so you could unfollow all these things and have a more active role on Facebook. And you can't get it today because they sued him. Right? Facebook has done experiments where they come in and say, let's show people more stuff that they asked for and less stuff they didn't ask for. And for free, you get less misinformation, less violence, less hate speech. So I think it's important to ask, well, why do we see this pattern? And it's because Facebook is always, every time you open your app, there is a world of content they can show you. There's probably 10 or 20,000 items they consider for you. And some of that is the stuff you asked for, and some of it is this other stuff. And when Facebook needs to prioritize, they need to pick out 100 pieces of things for you to see. Or at the beginning, they pick out 10 for you to see. And the way they do that, so it used to be, they had a little AI system, and they would guess how likely is this piece of content to keep you on Facebook, to keep you scrolling, maximize time spent. In 2018, they faced a problem. People on Facebook were beginning to produce less and less content. And they tried all these different experiments. And the only thing that got people to make more content was to give them more little hits of dopamine. So more likes, more comments, more reshares. And so they switched from time spent to this thing called meaningful social interactions. Meaningful. So if you had hate speech in the comments or bullying in the comments, that was meaningful. So let's just call it social interactions. And let's also be honest here. They did research 6 months later where they surveyed people and said, how meaningful is your newsfeed? And the meaningfulness of the newsfeed had actually declined in that period. So clearly this was not done because they want you to have meaningful connections with people. They just want you to have more interactions. They also found within 6 months, they sent researchers out all across Europe, and they found that because the shortest path to a click is hate, right? So like we've known for 75 years, more than that the easiest emotion to elicit, the easiest way it gets them to react is anger, right? Division, fear. Political parties across Europe were saying, hey, we know you changed the algorithm. Something's different, because it used to be that if we posted a white paper on our agricultural policy, and let's be honest here, most of governance is stuff like a white paper on agricultural policy. That's called life. If we post that white paper, it used to be that, it didn't get the most comments. It might not have gone reshared the most, but we could look at the statistics. We know people got to consume it. People saw it. And now if we post that exact same content, it's crickets. we are feeling forced to run positions we know our constituents don't like because they're the ones the algorithm will pick up and distribute. That's a huge problem. By the time we vote, Facebook voted first, and that is unacceptable.
Yeah, because basically, you know, I think of this as levers, you know, and they can look at how much activity are we getting, how many opt-ins, how many clicks, and then, you know, if you don't like the results you're getting, you can amp up some of the different levers, and you know, the end result being that that for us as legislators, if we want to communicate with constituents on Facebook, we are better off polarizing our speech.
Yes.
And that really jarred me when I read it.
Yeah.
Because, you know, at that time it was the first time I was really a candidate for office myself, and you know, I don't, you know, I try and not polarize my speech as much as possible.
Yeah.
But it's difficult if you know, if political parties know that the way that you're going to reach out to other people on Facebook, which is why you're there, is through more polarized speech patterns, because that's what's going to trigger you up on the newsfeed. And so it's a huge democratic problem. But what's interesting is that the book, and I really like this book, so I highly recommend it to anyone who's interested, because even I understood some of the deeper ways that Facebook work. But what's interesting is that it sort of follows through from the 2016 election to the 2020 election. And what they see is that at some point in 2020, they start jacking down the newsfeed because they understand, you know, we can't be part of, you know, what we're seeing
In the United States.
In the United States.
That's the key part.
That's the key part. In the United States, they think, you know, they have lots of, the book shows how they have lots of internal meetings, and they end up sort of like pulling the lever so that its polarized speech does not get as much boosts on the newsfeed as it would normally. But then my favorite part of the book is then the storming of Congress happens, and, you know, and they're like, oh my God, this is really, really bad. But then a few months later, they revert back to giving that sort of preference to polarizing speech. So, you know, you're sort of back to square one. But you decide to quit at around this time. So you're working with disinformation at what must have been a really interesting time to do so between the 2016 and the 2020 election. And then at some point you decide, I can't be part of this project anymore.
Yeah, so I left about 6 months after they dissolved the civic integrity team. So the order of events for folks is in April of 2020, a team was put together in January of 2020. So this is people all across the company to figure out what are soft interventions for at-risk countries. So at-risk countries are at risk of violence amplified or facilitated by Facebook. So hard intervention is we take someone off the platform, we take content off the platform. Soft interventions are things like, should we boost live video 850 times, given we can't oversee it at all because it's live, right? You know, questions like that. And one of the measures that was identified was a single parameter in the ranking function that basically was saying, instead of prioritizing the chance that you'll engage, what if we could use you as a tool? Because if you reshare it, all of your friends might engage. And it turns out just that one parameter is one of the most polarizing features.
Right.
So in April of 2020, when they proposed this, they say, hey, this is really dangerous. We've known this for 2 full years now. This is the most dangerous parameter. In at least at-risk countries, why don't we turn it off? Like, we're not going to lose any ads revenue. People don't stay less on the site. The only thing that changes is that meaningful social interactions number goes down, right? Because you've gotten rid of the downstream parameter. And Mark said he wasn't interested, right? It's like, if it hits that metric, because we have all these people's bonuses tied to it, that's a supposition. We don't know for sure that was his reasoning, but he says, we're not going to go broad with this. But then the riots happened in the United States.
Yes.
So Black Lives Matter takes off in the United States. You see COVID misinformation explode in 2020. And in languages that had something known as a civic classifier, and only a minority of languages have those, I'm sure they don't have it for Norwegian, they turned off that parameter for civic. But remember, they're not great at detecting it, so it's probably only turned off for maybe 25% of content, maybe 50% of content, at best.
So these are programs that try to detect certain kinds of speech.
Yep. And so they did it for health content, which probably means COVID, and they did it for civic, but only in some languages. And they didn't tell us which.
So pandemic disinformation, they're trying to catch that, for example, but in English.
And just in English and probably a handful of other languages. But we don't know. We don't know which languages. By the fall, So now they've got a wake-up call. They're like, we are responsible. We need to start turning down certain things. So they found a whole list of levers, like maybe 30 different levers where they put it back in a little safer setting for the election. And as soon as the election passes, within less than 30 days after the election, they dissolve my team. They're like, oh, there's no blood on the streets in the United States. We've clearly solved the civic problems of Facebook. We don't need this team anymore. They keep writing white papers that get discovered. And because no one was on deck, like no one actually was the voice of social responsibility now in the company, no one was there to turn those levers back on for the insurrection.
Right.
And what they found was at 5 p.m. Eastern on the day of January 6th, they had a meeting an hour before being like, oh no, this is going off the rails. Like, here's all the levers that were on election day. None of them are turned on yet. Like, we have a document from that moment. You come back a day later, and now 2/3 of them are on. So they could have, if they had been even a little on the ball, turned down the heat. And because they were asleep at the wheel, they weren't there. But even then, like you said, a couple of months goes by, and they're like, well, we really like growth.
Yep.
And they turned them, went back to the original settings.
Because if we sort of go over to policy now, we were talking over lunch that a lot of the regulatory debate often centers around speech. Who gets to be there, what kind of speech is allowed on these platforms. And while those are interesting debates, the fact of the matter is, in countries like Norway and the US, you have constitutionally protected freedom of speech. And so those are always going to be difficult legal questions. But, speech is one thing, but the algorithm, that's the whole ballgame.
And the other product choices.
And the other product choices, that's the whole ballgame. And I think that's maybe where we as legislators haven't been on the ball enough, that a lot of our debates will be about speech questions, which are really, really interesting, but very, very hard, and hard for us to regulate for obvious constitutionally protected reasons. But the algorithm and the products around, that's where a lot of the power here is in this relationship. So what should we be doing?
It's a product safety conversation. Right. This is not a speech conversation. This is a product safety conversation. Because if we had Facebook of 2008, it's always it breaks my heart a little bit when I talk to college students, because I'll be like, do you remember Facebook of 2008? Do you remember how much we loved it? Like no one thought democracy was endangered back then. And they're like, I was 5. And I'm like, oh yeah, I forgot about that part.
That's pretty much me every time I teach now. So,
but no, it's a real thing. Facebook knows when they show you more content from your family and friends, when they show you more content you asked for, you get safer content. Because the problem here is not bad people or bad ideas. It is a system that gives the most reach to the most extreme ideas. And I want to be really clear, like part of the reason why we focus on these arguments about censorship is because Facebook knew that no one could see how these systems worked, that there were only 300 or 400 people in the whole world who really understood these algorithmic systems well enough and how the product choices interacted with them, that they could tell us what the problem was any way they wanted, and we would never be able to argue with them, right? And so they told us, this is an argument about freedom of speech. And literally, Mark Zuckerberg has been going on podcasts, and he does the same thing on every one. He goes, I've had a really, really formative experience in the last 5 years because I've realized how hard it is to stand up for the right thing. And, I've chosen to be unpopular because I support freedom of speech. And I find it so irresponsible, because when we focus on censorship, we choose to leave behind small languages. Because focusing on content and not product safety means we have to rewrite those computer programs, the ones that find the bad things. We have to rewrite them over and over again. And what happens is the business model cannot support making sure that that this product is safe for like 1 billion people, right?
Right, because that's the reach right now. And I think there's
3 billion people that use it, but the people who are in places like Africa or Southeast Asia, places that are linguistically diverse, Facebook both doesn't make enough money to justify building the safety systems for those languages. When we focus on linguistic equity and building safe products, we make everyone safe instead of when we focus on censorship.
Because I think, going back to the Myanmar, they have a whole chapter on that in the book. And I think you, as you said, by way of introduction, in some countries, Facebook is synonymous with the internet. So in Myanmar, You know, as they write in a book, I obviously would not know. I do not speak any local languages. But for a lot of people, when they talk about the internet, they talk about Facebook because that's the internet platform they're on. And the really fascinating part of that chapter was that what they said from sort of a lot of people in Myanmar are quite well adapted to understanding government propaganda when it's in normal modes of information. If you see it on TV or if you read it in a newspaper, you will understand that you're probably getting some sort of regime propaganda. But if you get it on Facebook through a Facebook post, you're not
From
as
your
well
friend.
from your friend.
Yeah.
You're not as sensitive or acclimatized, and neither have we been. You know, obviously that's a process of learning to understanding that you're really being fed misinformation, but also polarizing speech that ultimately led to the perpetration of a massacre. And so it's a very, very serious outcome. But I never thought about, you know, one thing is how we in Western governments try and regulate this. A whole other question is, you know, what about places where Facebook is the way that you connect online, where there is no money or regulatory power to get at those questions whatsoever.
So I think this is where like the Nordics come into play, which is we need to be talking about product design from a linguistic equity framework, right? That when we design things around the dynamics of these systems, so I'll give you a really clear example. Let's imagine Alice writes something, it lands in her friend Bob's newsfeed. Bob reshares it and lands in Carol's newsfeed. So this is friends of friends. Now, Carol reshares it and lands in Dan's newsfeed. So now we are beyond friends of friends. If you cut the reshare chain at 2 hops, so beyond friends of friends, and say, hey, Dan, we believe in free speech. You can say anything you want. You can copy and paste that. It could be the most extreme speech in the world. We don't care. If you copy and paste it, if you make a choice, if you are a human in the loop, you can say whatever you want. But we're not going to let you just knee-jerk hit reshare. If you do just that, you have the same impact on misinformation as the entire third-party fact-checking program. Which one protects speech more? Picking out dangerous ideas that are hyper-viral or cutting the reshare chains at 2? And the cool thing is, it works in Myanmar.
Right.
Right.
Because like basically you're saying like making it harder to just thoughtlessly reshare things that you're sent.
Intentionally designing for choice, for choice and autonomy, and valuing that autonomy, saying that humans making decisions is valuable, is what I'm advocating for.
Right. So in terms of like what that would look like in practice, you're saying that, for example, if I get a link from a friend on Facebook and I share it without having read it, for example, you know, Facebook then asking, you know, are you sure about sharing this?
Would you like to read it first?
Would you like to read it first?
Just click it.
Right.
Yeah.
And the value of that would be a lot less people sharing.
So it's not even a question of a lot less. It's about 10% less misinformation. If you say, hey, you have to leave, have you thought about clicking on this link? Right? Imagine if we made them wait for 30 seconds. I know, it's scandalous. It's one of these things where giving people time to think, giving time for them to make decisions has a huge impact. And actually, it's interesting. It's often these conversations come down to these questions about, do we trust people? Right? It's like, do we need censorship? Like, do we trust people? Or like, is the issue that, you know, this information is so dangerous? If we flip the question and said, you know, we trust people and we value people so much, we want them in the loop more. It happens to be when we remove the mindlessness, we lose a lot of the misinformation for free.
Yeah. So like, you know, when you're thinking regulation, you're thinking about this kind of regulation, where you then make social media companies create programs whereby, you know, when you get sent a link and you try and reshare, you get a question, do you want to read this first?
Yeah.
And that act in itself will have such a positive effect.
So the 2 things I recommend legislatively, so I've been very consistent since the beginning, while the internet conspiracy theorists think I'm a dark horse for censorship, the only 2 things I've advocated for are around legally mandated transparency that is auditable. Because the reality is Facebook has a lot of things like this that are around the dynamics of the system. And every time they faced one of these choices, like I got a note from a policy person who was like, this whole cutting the reshare chains at 2 is irrelevant. We only had one review of this. And I wonder right back, I'm like, of course you only had one review. I'm sure it hits profit by like 0.2%. Of course it's not acceptable. At Facebook, if there's any hit to profit, any hit to session length, you're not going to get to do it. And so we need to set up a world where Facebook isn't just reporting to the public how many people it has on the site and how many dollars it made from those people and how much money it had to spend to get that profit. We have to require them to report misinformation, to report what languages can they do these safety systems in. When we make them accountable for more numbers, when they face those little trade-offs, they'll choose the public good more often. And I think we have evidence of that from Twitter, right? Twitter requires you to click on a link before you reshare it.
Right.
And I think part of the reason for that is they publish 1/10 of all their tweets, and anyone in the world can get them. If you want to pay them some money, they'll give you all the tweets. And because of that, a huge number of influence operations on Facebook are caught on Twitter. Is that crazy?
So Twitter has
Yeah.
systems, quite simple systems.
Yeah.
That means they catch somebody's disinformation campaigns.
No. Public researchers catch these campaigns.
Right.
But because Twitter knows people are watching, when they face these little trade-offs, they're like, should we, if we require them to click on a link, we're going to get 10, 15% less misinformation, but we're going to lose 0.1% of profit. Because they have a ballast that is public accountability, right? Like people are watching and complaining about Twitter's misinformation. That trade-off was worthwhile. But if you don't make it be attention, now they only get pulled towards the profit and loss statement.
Right. Because I think, if we look at, you took a lot of documents with you when you left Facebook that you published as a whistleblower. And I think
I gave them to Congress.
you gave them to Congress, yes,
Yeah.
which was very civic duty minded of you to do. Because
And the SEC.
And the SEC, yeah, which I thought was really interesting. Because I think, you're trying to bring some of this transparency, to the process. And I think these documents showed a lot of different things. And I know that one of the things that it showed, which I know that a lot of legislators here care about, is the effect on children that social media has, which is something that we discuss quite a lot in Parliament in different ways. And especially, that Facebook had done internal studies on self-esteem of teenage girls, for example, using the platform. What do you think in terms of regulation on how can we think about regulation in that sense?
So I think there's, again, to just give some context on transparency. Back when I did my tour in November, a very senior leader in the UK said, hey, we had a conversation with Facebook where we said, we are worried about kids being overexposed to self-harm content. Because the reality is Facebook has run the same experiment a bunch of times in different contexts, where they start with a brand new account, so blank account, so no friends, no interests, and they follow some very mainstream interests like healthy eating, healthy recipes, and then all they do is just click on the content Instagram gives them, and they follow hashtags that Instagram suggests. And within 2 weeks, they get sent to eating disorder content. Because the algorithm is always looking for what's the thing you're most likely to engage with, and it just keeps climbing up that hill.
So you're clicking on healthy foods and then maybe a bit of exercise and some summer body hashtags. In 2 weeks' time, you will end up with eating disorders
and self-harm. Yeah. And, the government official said, we asked them how many people have been overexposed to self-harm content, because the same thing happens for kids who cut themselves or who have suicidal ideation. And they said, we don't know. We don't track self-harm content. Right. And so it's one of these things where if Facebook was required to disclose what are the harm types they track, and then how many people are overexposed to those, very rapidly they would put modifications into the algorithm. And TikTok claims to do this. I don't know if they do or not. TikTok claims that if they see someone over-focusing on a single subject, they will diversify out their interests. Remember, this is content agnostic.
Because again, back to the power of the algorithm. The algorithm can sense that you are going down the path of eating disorder content.
It knows that there's a topic that you're getting very passionate about. And that others got very passionate about it before you.
And that wasn't that great.
Well, they don't know.
They don't know this, but
they intentionally don't ask.
Right.
Yeah.
But then you can do the sort of the opposite effect. You can pull them out with maybe you'll be interested in this thing instead and this thing instead, and then try and get them on another path.
Yeah. I'll give you an example. When I worked at Pinterest, we had a much more basic version of our algorithm than Facebook had. And our algorithm was always saying, what's the thing you're most likely to repin next? And unsurprisingly, the thing you are most likely to repin next is the thing most similar to the last thing you repinned. So if you just start from that framework, because remember, the algorithm just tries to do what you tell it to do. It's not intelligent. It doesn't know about what you actually want. It's an abstraction of desire. It didn't know that humans get bored, right? If I just show you exactly the same thing over and over again, you'd be like, oh, this is kind of boring. And so we added in the concept of variety. We said, for every time you see a topic, we're gonna make it a little less likely you'll see the topic in the next pin, right? We're gonna give it just a little tiny demotion. And Facebook could be doing that. They could be coming in and saying, hey, we know that people sometimes get stuck in doom scrolling loops.
We've all been there.
We've all been there.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we can say, hey, like, we're going to make sure that no single topic makes up more than 10% of your feed.
Right.
Or in the case of doom scrolling, this is the thing with kids. One of the frameworks that we're trying to introduce, because we're having ESG conversations with investors now, is around this question of, does your product intentionally demonstrate that it values people's autonomy and dignity? So imagine if Instagram said to kids, hey, we noticed for quite a number of nights you've been staying up till 2 a.m. looking at some dark stuff. Do you want to set a time in the evening when we'll just start to slow the app down for you? We'll do it real slowly. You won't even notice it's happening. But at some point, you'll kind of lose interest in Instagram because we'll keep making it a little bit slower. If you were a hacker and you were attacking Facebook, Facebook could give you this privilege. But we don't give 16-year-olds who might kill themselves this privilege. Right? It's that simple.
It's basically slowing down.
Just slow it down.
Just
because
so that you don't get those dopamine hits.
It's actually actually a thing where like Google knew this. So Google, there's a lot that's been written on how Google was always obsessed with latency, like how fast the site was, because even slowing it down 5%, they could see people search less often.
We are basic creatures.
We're very basic creatures.
Yes.
And so this is this question, like, what if we said to platforms, like, one of the ways we evaluate whether or not you deserve to have a relationship with the public is, do you value autonomy and dignity? Do you acknowledge that this might be addictive? Because one of the papers that on the teen stuff, Facebook said, hey, all this teen stuff is being taken out of context. Some of these studies have very small sample sizes. And the Wall Street Journal told Facebook before they published 6 documents, they said, before we're going to publish these, we're going to give Facebook a chance to comment. And Facebook, against what they said they were going to do, rushed out the door and published a subset of those documents themselves. So they published like 2 out of the 6, or like 3 out of the 6, the ones with the small sample sizes.
Right.
But the paper in there that had the largest sample size had 100,000 people. So not a small sample size, and it was on addiction. And the top population, the one that has the highest rate of problematic use, is 14-year-olds.
Right.
And we have to have that conversation.
Right. I mean, I find it difficult as a 36-year-old to self-regulate on
Yeah.
social media. So I can only imagine. And I've given that a lot of thought. Like I got Facebook when I was 2019.
Yeah.
I'm just old enough to have skipped that generation to have it in high school. But I have students who have had it since they were kids, and you're asking a lot of a 13, 14-year-old to self-regulate online in a way that we maybe haven't understood. And also, it's interesting then that Facebook will know more about your teenager in terms of what they're actually, drifting towards interest-wise than you will know as a parent.
100%.
100%. And then that gravitational pull of the algorithm. Yeah. But how do we find out more about the algorithm? Like, you talk about transparency. Like, for us who don't know tech, what does that mean?
So right before I do that, I want to touch just real quick when you're talking about this idea of parents. People are putting a lot of pressure on parents right now, where they're like, why is the state getting involved? Isn't this the parents' fault? And I was in the UK last week, and I met with the parents of this boy named Ollie Stevens. And Ollie was getting horribly bullied online, and he eventually died because some kids fell down a rabbit hole around knife culture. And he was a 13-year-old who got stabbed to death by some other 13-year-olds because of stuff they saw on Instagram. And the thing the parents told me that broke my heart was they tried to take their son's phone away. Right. And because it's addictive, and it's like taking, a score away from an addict, he ran away from home. And when they couldn't find him because he had fallen asleep in a park and he had mild hypothermia. Right? And so we have to talk about features in products that allow people to step away. It can't just be a parents take phones away, but to talk about how do we have oversight on algorithms. It can be really simple, right? If Facebook had to publish every post, so Twitter has the fire hose, so that's 1/10 of all the tweets. If Facebook had to publish every post.
Maybe not everyone knows about this.
Oh,
for
sorry.
Twitter. Yes.
Sure.
Yeah.
So Twitter has something called a fire hose. So it's an endpoint, like a little thing you talk to. You can say, I wish to study Twitter. Please show me 1/10 of all the tweets. And people bring it down and they make research data sets out of it. And there's probably at least 10,000 researchers in the world that are always monitoring this. Like some of them are in militaries. Some of them are just protecting brands. Coca-Cola has a bunch of these people. Less noble reasons, but still important. Imagine if Facebook had the same little window. So, we're not asking to see, everyday people's posts. We're saying if something is seen by 100,000 people, it's not private anymore. And if we saw all of those posts, instantaneously, we'd say this is unacceptable. Like the stuff that you're giving the most reach to is disproportionately extreme content. So I'll give you a quick example. BuzzFeed, that August news organization, wrote to Facebook after they made the 2018 change, like a year later, and said, hey, we've been looking at what content does the best on Facebook, and it's like the content we're most ashamed of. Right? It's like stuff that plays on people's racism or their sexism. It brings out the worst in people. And if we could see every post that got more than 100,000 views, we would ask a lot of questions.
That is something that we can definitely look into.
Yeah.
We have to go vote in like 4 minutes.
Yeah.
But do you want to give us some final thoughts if you have any?
Sure.
We could have done this for hours.
Yeah.
This was so engaging.
Well, I now have some support to come back again, so I'm sure we'll have another conversation.
Yes.
I think there's a real voice for the Nordics in actually being an advocate for those billion people who don't get a choice to step away. Right? If you speak English, you have a lot of options for where to get information on the internet. But if you speak a language where 80 or 90% of all the content in that language is only on Facebook, that's like the majority of languages in the world now. You don't get a choice to leave. And the Nordics, together in coalition with Canada, with Australia, with other smaller parties, make up a meaningful size population. So when the UK last year passed a bill that improved children's rights online, said things like children deserve to not be targeted with ads. Like under 16, no targeted ads. Because that was one of the ways that eating disorders were getting fanned. Yeah. Strangely enough, Instagram changed a bunch of policies the same week that took effect. If you can get a coalition together that has 100 million people, you can have Facebook change. And I really think the Nordics have a perspective of valuing smaller languages. And there are a lot of people in places like Ethiopia where their language might be spoken by 20 million people, 30 million people, and that is still considered too small by Facebook to be considered worthy of having basic safety protections. And so I really believe there is a voice for Norway. There's a voice for the Nordics to really bring peace and justice to all people who use the internet. So.
That's a beautiful form of solidarity. I think you've given us another perspective on this.
Yeah, it's about linguistic equity, not about censorship. Let's design products for safety and not try to fix them afterwards with magic AI. So thank you.
Thank you so much.
Oh, yeah? Oh.
I've heard that this is a latte cup
Oh.
with Parliament on it.
Oh, delightful.
Because we are a latte party, as
Oh.
I've heard.
Oh, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. We're going to give you a tour.
Oh, yeah? Oh, delightful. That's so wonderful. Yes, of course.
This was